My name is Gordon Ivis. On August 9th of 2015, I emerged on foot from the woods onto a long, unmarked dirt road just east of the Blaine Fountain Town line in northern Carolinas County. A little wobbly, I walked down the road toward a cutout in the trees where I'd parked my car, and I got in, dropping my backpack and tent pack into the passenger seat. A wave of faintness washed over me, and when it passed, I tried in vain for several minutes to recite the names of the first 5 presidents. I didn't even come close. I drove away from that lonely area, and as soon as I could get a cell signal, I got up my phone and called a colleague of mine and left a message for him to meet me at a Days Inn off Route 21 in 3 hours at 10 a.m. I checked into the motel, and then I showered and shaved, looking hard at my exhausted, pale face in the mirror. After that, I collapsed on top of the bed, falling asleep instantly. The alarm woke me just 45 minutes later. Kurt Kapremian, a sociology fellow at Francis Drake University, met me outside in the parking lot, and we immediately began to drive 20 miles into the middle of rural Carolinas County, directly back where I had come from earlier that morning, toward a stretch of barren woods and plains that nobody ever noticed. We saw little but farms and forests as we went, passing fewer and fewer cars. Eventually we turned off onto that unmarked dirt road that stretched north and south, a connector to Greentown Road and routes out of the area. And we parked in the same secluded spot I'd initially found 3 days before. We got out and headed into the woods. I explained everything to Kurt as we hiked. No one had legally owned the tract of land we were headed toward until the year 1901. It had been bought by a turf farm and held for 30 years. They went out of business before they could expand enough to use it. Eventually it defaulted to the state, which never did anything with it. Starfleet Cellular had bought it 20 years ago, and technically they still owned it, but they had such financial problems that the chances of ever being able to build their towers out this far seemed more slim by the day. Less than a mile into the woods, we came out into a vast, dead stretch of flatland, marked by small slopes, bushes, weeds, snarls of ivy, scarred patches 100 yards across where no grass grew anymore. Nothingness. It rolled out beyond the horizon, more than 1,200 acres in total, most of it lying to the west of where Kurt and I stood. That spot was where I had slept the 2 nights before. I explained to Kurt that 2 nights were all I'd been able to take. I'd begun to feel too strange. My dreams were hideous. I'd found myself walking in circles and not realizing it. I'd found in my research since June that domestic abuse incidents were 200% higher in the closest surrounding rural neighborhoods than those just beyond them, moving from a concentric circle. Car wrecks were 20% more frequent despite 1/10 of the traffic. I'd started looking at the tract after a newspaper report about a college student who had camped out here while methodically bumming his way to New York. He'd walked into a police station afterward and just collapsed. He had no memories of being here, and so his friends had to piece together how long he'd been camping in these dead fields. Shortly, he dropped out of school with no explanation to anyone. He was later killed in Afghanistan. I got curious. That led me to finding another thing, and eventually I became convinced there was something seriously wrong here. As in Hengist Castle in Tintrim, Scotland, where Kurt and I had spent 3 strange nights 2 years before, I believed there was a truly damaging and unpredictable energy all around us. But this one felt more predatory. I let Kurt wander a bit, getting a feel for the air here, the silence. As usual when we came to a new place of interest to our work, he uttered not a word as he stood, gazing into the distance, staring at the ground. Nothing spoken from the time we first parted the woods. Before too long I suggested we leave. I was already feeling just a little lightheaded. Over coffee at a diner in Temperanceville, Kurt had me explain in much more detail the dreams I'd had in the tract. It almost felt a little foolish to speak of them. Stop signs. That's what I dreamed of. Lots of stop signs in the middle of a big field surrounding me. In the dreams I would close my eyes, and when I opened them again, those signs would have moved a tiny bit closer. Cold, angular, and sharp. I was waiting for them to behead me somehow. I knew it was coming, but I felt powerless to keep it from happening. Kurt inquired about that second thing that had made me more curious about the place initially. That incident I told him I was going to explain, but I was momentarily confused. I was sure I'd already told him the story of the homeless woman. Told it to him back as we stood outdoors in the tract. But he assured me that I hadn't mentioned it. And I realized it was true. So I was still not quite right in the head. I'd have to take a couple of days away from my classes, clearly. Even my body still felt wrong, my limbs heavier somehow, my joints creaky. I told Kurt that 7 years ago, a homeless woman had slept on the north end of the tract for 8 consecutive nights. On her way out, she'd walked to the house that was closest geographically to the tract, and had tried to trap a family inside it and burn them alive. For no apparent reason. She had no connection to the family whatsoever, and no criminal history. Kurt had actually noticed that house off Greentown Road as we'd driven, sitting alone surrounded by trees. They'd had to completely rebuild it. Only the original chimney remained. The current owner, a Mr. Litko, a retired rail engineer, had shown me the exterior scarring it still bore from the flames. He himself knew very little of the tract. Never went there. Never heard distant shots as if someone had decided to do a little illegal deer hunting on it. It was to him a foreign land. I outlined my plan for Kurt. I would camp again in the tract, only this time I would set up a video feed, and he and I would be in constant communication, so he could monitor me from his home and his office. But Kurt, always cautious, always methodical in our years of working together off and on, needed more to go on. He wasn't seeing enough evidence yet of a place worth serious study. I'd been working for the past 2 months on contacting and perhaps visiting that homeless woman in the state facility where she now lived, but I would likely need a couple more. Crafting a convincing story to be able to speak to her was a tricky business. So Kurt and I agreed to put off my plan until that meeting could be made to happen. On a gray, rainy day in mid-September, I drove 40 miles north to the dumpy strip mall town of Adair. I had an 11 o'clock appointment at St. Martin's Hospital. The place had the feel of more of an assisted living home than a care center for the mentally ill. The doctor I had dealt with was named Pratt. He wasn't more than 30. He very politely went over some reminders of the conditions of my visit, which we'd covered on the phone already. Asking Ms. DeVere any questions about her possible guilt or innocence in the matter 7 years before was out of bounds, but everything else was fine. We walked the length of the hospital, and then out a rear door, leading to a covered outdoor walkway, just barely protecting us from the rain on either side of us. It led us into something called the Close Supervision Wing. Ms. DeVere still lived in this part of the building, Pratt told me, though she hadn't had any real IOCs, incidents of concern, for about 2 years. He saw no problem in leaving us alone to our talk while he attended to some other business. She was sitting in a rec room when I came in, dressed in blue sweatpants and a sweatshirt with the Sierra Club logo on it. She stood up immediately to greet me and offered me a warm smile and a handshake, telling me to call her Bella. She thanked me for coming. She was not only lucid, polite, and aware, but downright professional somehow, as if she were an interviewee for a faculty position at the college where I worked. Bella was in her mid-50s and relatively trim, her hair carefully combed. I had falsely convinced her and Dr. Pratt that I was writing a book about the homeless. She seemed interested in my publishing history, and we chatted for a bit about some of her favorite books. She had a fondness for reading big, sprawling historical novels. Sitting there talking about James Michener and Leon Uris, I almost questioned whether I really was, in fact, talking to a woman who had tried to burn a family alive inside their home, sending a man and wife to intensive care with cases of smoke inhalation so severe that their respiration would never be the same. My attempts to reach them had been firmly rebuked. I asked Bella how she'd come to be homeless. She said it had been nothing terribly unique. She'd become addicted to painkillers, lost her sister to cancer, and made a few very bad decisions in desperation to keep her head above water. One thing had led to another. I zeroed in quickly, a little too quickly probably, on her time in the tract. She remembered it only vaguely. She remembered spending some time at the end near that house, the one off Greentown Road with the pretty chimney. But you couldn't really say what she did there or why. She'd been quite mentally ill by that time, she believed, and had been for about 2 years. As for the question of whether it had all seemed to get worse for her out there, in the middle of nowhere, whether she felt lonelier or stranger as time went on, she didn't think that was it. She'd just been trying to pull herself together before deciding where to go next, after being dropped off by someone who had offered to drive her all the way to Virginia, but had suddenly changed his mind. She recalled it being very bleak in the tract, and she had very little to eat. As she spoke, she maintained her smile, idly brushed a piece of lint off her sweatshirt. If anyone, she reminded me of my Aunt Amy, a math teacher. I told Bella I'd been thinking of spending a little time out there where she had camped, to sort of see and feel what she must have seen and felt. There was an odd pause, and she told me pleasantly that she didn't think I wanted to do that. I let her go on. Certainly, she said, nothing that happened out there made her try to kill that family. Which is probably what you're most curious about, right? She asked. Again, I said nothing. The impulse to do that terrible thing, she explained, had come from some awful place inside her that was no longer there. She said, "Don't go," spacing out the words to an unusual degree. I told her I understood, and I was about to try some other topic with her, something to take us out of the moment for a bit, when she said again, a little more directly, "Don't go there." She was still perfectly pleasant. But that was the third time she'd warned me in the space of a minute, as if her mind had gotten stuck in a record groove. She held her gaze on me longer than I was comfortable with, and I looked at the floor. She asked me then if I could get her a soda from the machine out in the hallway. It was a perfect time for me to regroup a little, then come back with a new line of questioning, if I could even think of one. I rose and I went through the open door. The soda machine was about 30 feet away near a bathroom. There were 2 other people in the hallway who I perceived to be patients. A woman sitting on a sofa beneath a TV set with the volume turned off, looking somewhat sleepy-eyed. The other, a much older man, was standing near a bookcase and flipping through the pages of a magazine with a rapidity suggesting some sort of compulsion. Dr. Pratt was much further down the hall, chatting with a colleague. As I walked, I could see that the soda machine dispensed only bottled water for no charge. I was putting my change back into my pocket when I heard something from behind me. Quick, muffled footsteps, and then a voice. Bella's voice. Rising, rising. Just before I began to turn, I saw Pratt looking up in my direction with alarm. In my peripheral vision, I then saw Bella approaching me fast, saying only the word "no" again and again, louder and louder. No, 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 no! She was carrying something in both hands, swinging it at the back of my head, the folding chair she'd been sitting in, and I wasn't able to fully ward off the blow when she hit me. A sharp, eerily precise strike to the neck with full force as her mouth formed a gaping O, her eyes wild, intent on murder. I lost consciousness even before the others in the hallway brought her down, and I stayed out until I was taken into an ambulance and away from there. On October 17th, the video feed connecting me and my home near Catskill University to Kurt Kapremian in the woods of Carolinas County chirped into unsteady life on our respective laptop computers. Kurt had pitched camp only 100 yards from my own original point of entry into the tract, between two small hills that were only a brief hike to one of two shallow, lifeless swamps I'd come across. The day was unseasonably cold. The slight pixelation of the image sucked most of the color from the wild grasses and choked ground all around Kurt. It had taken longer than we'd planned to get the feed working, and I was due for my next physical therapy session in an hour. So upon that first contact, we didn't talk much. The good news was that Kurt's battery situation had been improved drastically by an IT guy at Francis Drake, and it was self-evident that his portable Wi-Fi station was working to perfection, though getting a signal on his cell was pretty much impossible still. The bad news was that I had been told by my doctor that day that no more pain medication was forthcoming, and so I probably wouldn't be able to make the short hike out to see Kurt, or resupply him if the situation ever called for it. I'd be moving very carefully for another couple of weeks. Even as I told Kurt this, though, I could see two tents in the camera frame behind his left shoulder. He'd gone ahead and brought his sister along, Jill, a chemistry lecturer at Stepridge. He saw no reason there shouldn't be two of them out there, and since she was quite familiar with the nature of the unusual work that Kurt and I undertook from time to time, he saw no danger. After all, she'd been in the army, as he was very fond of telling me, and if brawn were ever called for, she was the better bet. He had related to her the entire story, everything that both he and I knew up to that moment. I wasn't pleased that he had brought her someplace so potentially unpredictable, but there was nothing I could do, and it did make sense. At the moment she was off gathering firewood in case they felt isolated and unseen enough that night to use it. For the last 6 miles of their journey out into the tract, they'd seen no one at all on lonely Green Town Road, and had discovered an even more secluded option for leaving their car. Kurt's plan that night was simply to do some reading. It was already getting toward dusk. We would dial back in with each other at 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. the next day. We said goodnight, and I closed out of the video application. After physical therapy, feeling on edge and cut off, I finally transcribed the handwritten notes I'd taken out in the tract 2 months before, just to re-experience things a little. There was an episode out there I'd already forgotten about. I'd become unaccountably sleepy out near the edge of the South Swamp, and fallen asleep in a patch of reeds until almost dark. Upon waking, there had been a couple of seconds, just a couple, when I didn't seem to be able to move my arms and legs. as if I were being held down. In my notes, I had put this down to a brief episode of sleep paralysis, but that had been on the first day of my 3 out there, and by the time I'd left, the sleep paralysis explanation seemed delusional somehow. The next day at noon, Kurt transmitted some video he'd taken for me. Over the course of 3 hours, he'd been able to cover pretty much the entire walkable area of the tract, but nothing he sent back was any real surprise to me. In his long montage of shots of the little hills and copses of trees, the depressions and the thatches of foliage that seemed to grow so randomly, I tried to detect any sort of pattern or unusual detail that I might have missed the first time. As when I had camped there, what surprised me most was the utter lack of litter, even in the woods. There was not a stray soda bottle, cigarette butt, or plastic bag anywhere in the tract. The one time Kurt's sister Jill became visible in the video, with Kurt tracking her briefly with a camera, she actually commented on this. There was, however, one sign of human presence, however ancient. None of the 7 people I'd spoken to who had a passing knowledge of the tract had been able to explain it fully. Toward the top of the tract's biggest hill was a fairly vast, settled heap of rotted, weather-eroded wood, probably more than a century old, having been naturally broken down to almost nothing. The remains of a barn, most likely, or maybe a pair of them, almost like the remnants of a past civilization. The longest piece of intact wood was maybe 4 feet long. It all spread out over a stretch of almost 40 yards. Little by little over the decades, wind and rain had sucked the wood of all color and texture, while beating and crushing and burying it so that the entire mass reached a height of maybe 10 inches off the ground. Grass and vines wrapped most of it in a snarled death grip, to the point where the majority of the pieces couldn't even be lifted to see the ground beneath it. I had pried a few of them up when I was out there, but it had been a difficult and somewhat repellent task. Termites seemed to have been agonizingly slow in finishing it all off. In the video, Kurt seemed to stare at those fallen remnants for an unusually long time, thinking, considering. But he made no comment. That night, after my physical therapy trainer left, I ventured out of my house for the first time in 8 days, stir-crazy from the confinement my injury had forced upon me. As usual, it was hard going just pulling myself out of my wheelchair onto my feet. I hobbled over to the door and took my time, walking like a very old man out to my car, frustrated at my continued shakiness. I collapsed onto the driver's seat, wincing in pain. On the other end of my trip, my destination being the Fox Chase Cafe 9 miles away, I foolishly left my laptop's power cable in the car, and the thought of dragging myself back to it from the cafe's front door was depressing enough to make me consider totally foregoing the work I had in mind. But I forced myself to get it. I had been in the cafe for about an hour when my cell phone rang. It was Jamie, my graduate assistant. I had told her back in August that I was working on notes for a book about rural Carolinas County, and more specifically, the unpopulated area east of Blaine Fountain. Another white lie. The day before, she'd managed to find a text of interest in the Special Collections Wing at Steppridge, a book listed in the database only as The Diary of a Resident of Carolinas County, 1848 to 1849. An authentic diary, not a reproduction. Jamie offered to take a look through it for me, but since I was still on medical leave from Catskill, I told her I'd go to Steppridge myself the next day. I'd have to read the diary there, because special collections material was deemed to be too valuable or fragile to check out. In this case, the latter condition, I was sure. In the morning, the video feed to the tract came to life right at 9 a.m. as Kurt and I had agreed. Kurt and his sister Jill, who turned 41 that day, were sitting in folding chairs beside each other. They had a little news for me, something they'd captured on video that was of some interest. And after a few false text starts, Kurt was able to replay a 6-minute segment he'd spent the morning editing together. At about 11 the previous evening, right around the time I'd left the Fox Chase Cafe, Kurt and Jill had retired to their respective tents for the night, after jotting down some notes from the day, just tedious details on how they were feeling and thoughts they'd experienced, as I had requested. As usual, they left the camera going and aimed in a wide shot at the area where they camped, so both of their tents were in view, but just barely visible with the night vision setting engaged. A couple of hours later, when they were both asleep, a few birds landed very close to Jill's tent, and then 5 or 6 settled on top of the tent itself. Once there, they didn't really move. At one point I counted 11 birds either on top of her tent or within 3 feet of it, and those were just the ones I could spot in the dark frame. There was a jump cut, and Kurt estimated that the next patch of video showed a time period perhaps 40 minutes later. Some of the birds had flown off while others still remained, not feeding, just inert or turning their heads this way or that. And then a much larger, dark shape came down from the night sky and appeared near Jill's tent. It was most likely a vulture, twice as big as any of the other birds. It settled, and then after about 30 seconds, it literally walked directly into Jill's tent, through the open flap, disappearing. She had remained asleep and oblivious. The video cut once again, and now the first light of dawn could be seen in the far distance. All the other birds gone now, the enormous vulture was seen to finally emerge from the tent, and in short order it flew out of frame. Upon waking, Jill found no evidence it had ever been there. At no point had any of the birds gone toward Kurt's tent, not even for a moment. And when Kurt had scanned through the entire video, neither he nor Jill saw the vulture leave it, not until dawn. A head-scratcher, sure, but we didn't see what we could learn from the episode. Kurt and Jill still felt perfectly fine. They engaged in a bit of humor about what had happened, though Jill assured us that she would be securing her tent that night. I asked Kurt if this reminded him at all of the incident at the supposedly cursed Hengist Castle, when a conversation we'd been having was interrupted by a large bang that came from the front entrance. We'd opened the door to find a severely injured ram. Our video man had seen what happened from an upper floor. The ram had broken into a gallop from a field 100 yards away and charged the door suicidally for no apparent reason. Kurt pointed out rightfully the many dissimilarities between that episode and this one. Outside of the episode with the birds, I could tell he and Jill were becoming increasingly bored, which was to be expected. We decided to cap their stay at 4 nights, if nothing unusual happened. The Special Collections Library at Steppridge University is only open 4 hours a day. It's in a suitably archaic basement below the campus's Performing Arts Center. The assistant there took me through an aisle of metal racks and pulled down for me a transparent plastic box marked only by a number and a colored dot. My Catskill ID got me a cubicle for the afternoon, and I settled down with what Steppridge had catalogued as The Diary of a Resident of Carolinas County, 1848 to 1849. The thing was in pretty bad shape. Every page I turned threatened to detach from the binding. The man who had owned this diary had written his name on the first page, Orrin Loveland. He'd only occasionally remembered to date his entries, which were voluminous. I settled in, happy to read the thing from cover to cover, but not really expecting anything to jump out specifically about the area of the tract, and approaching it more as a potentially interesting glimpse into local history. From the first 50 entries or so, I was able to piece together, through the man's dense and difficult handwriting, that he'd once been a tobacconist. But by the time he'd moved to nearby Lorengore from parts unknown, that business had foundered. He had a wife and 2 children. He liked to write his thoughts about books he'd read and the lesson plans he was making for his children, whom he was homeschooling. The rest of the diary was filled with random notes about improvements to the tiny house he'd built himself, his experiments with cooking, his dreams at night, stories he wrote for his kids, his occasional descriptions of his walks and hunts, and the fact that his only interactions were with his family, seemingly by design, suggested a strangely lonely existence for all of them. About 30 pages in, there was a reference to something called Cattle Road. This rang a bell. In normal circumstances, I would have walked to the main library across the quad to research maps of Carolinas County, but the pain in my neck and back and shoulders was really bad that day, and it was too great a trek. So I called Jamie, and I was lucky enough to catch her in a 3-hour gap between classes. In only 45 minutes, she confirmed for me via text that Cattle Road had in 1920 been renamed Greentown Road, which meandered toward the unmarked one that I, and later Kurt and Jill, had parked on to enter the tract. Settling in again with the diary, I became hopeful that this man had lived somewhere very close to the tract, and might actually reveal a little of its story. But I got more than that. Things became truly interesting with the entry of November 9, 1849, after which the diary became a very different sort of document. The author of the diary, Orrin Loveland, had been sitting at the kitchen table of the cabin he'd built, kneading dough in the middle of the afternoon, when he heard his wife's worried voice out in the main room. Their teenaged son, Terry, had entered from outside, carrying his little sister, June, in his arms. She'd had a bit of a shock while they were out racing thorn dolls down a nearby creek, and she needed some consoling. Terry reported that they'd seen a man standing far away in the trees, near something Loveland referred to only as the Big Hill. The man's face had either been severely deformed, or he'd been wearing a mask. Neither Terry nor little June was sure which was the case. Terry wasn't even sure the stranger had any arms. He'd never seen a face like that before, one that seemed to have been, in his words, put together wrong. The man had just been standing there, not moving, and June had seen him and begun to scream and run, having to be chased, making Terry lose sight of the man for good. Loveland wrote then of the conversation he had later that night with his wife, Darcy, before bed. She had not been nervous about living in such isolation until that very day. It had been a full month since any of them had even seen a single other human being. Darcy asked her husband just how long the 4 of them were obliged to live in such a manner. There followed a murky reference to something that may have happened in town the year before, something that Loveland needed people to forget before he and his family returned. The very next day after the little girl June had received her scare, Loveland took his children back to the creek, giving them lessons as they walked. There was an amusing passage in which Loveland described June's difficulty with keeping straight the combatants of the Revolutionary War. She kept referring to them both as the Englands. She was also having a little trouble with the concept of Indians, and apparently wanted to buy one someday. It was during this passage, which I read only 15 minutes before I'd have to surrender the diary back to the archives overnight, that a reference to a specific feature of the geography made my pulse race a little. In teaching Terry that day a few of the subtleties of orienteering and trying to playfully trick him a little, Loveland happened to describe their exact position as they walked back home from the creek. From this I made a wild guess that what he called the creek was in fact a dry bed that wandered for a few hundred yards on the north end of the tract, bottoming out in the tiny swamp I myself had fallen asleep beside, and which Kurt had just captured on video. I placed the diary carefully back inside the transparent plastic box and assured the librarian that I'd be back when special collections opened again the next day. I was late getting back home, and it was almost twilight by the time I hooked back into Kurt's video feed. He was staring off into the distance when the feed kicked in, looking pale and tired. Much stranger was the fact that he was wearing something on his head. It was a rudimentary crown of leaves, made by hand, stitched together out of boredom, I supposed. He didn't have a lot to report that evening. When I asked him where Jill was, he seemed vaguely confused. He wasn't absolutely sure. She'd been gone for about an hour. She went for walks a lot, he said, assuring me that she was fine. I asked him about his odd headwear. He chuckled a little. He wasn't sure what had gotten into him. He then began to explain for me, unasked, the origin of the laurel crown. Apollo, he said, fell in love with Daphne, but she was so horrified that she fled and asked the river god to turn her into a laurel tree. Apollo declared the tree sacred and broke off a branch to wear in her memory. So the laurel crown was really a symbol of empty victories. Olympians rarely knew that, Kurt said pensively. That didn't explain for me why he was wearing one, and he truly did not have an explanation. He said again it was just something that had occurred to him. This was followed by another uncertain half-laugh and a resumption of his watch of the horizon. I told Kurt I thought he should find Jill and get out of the tract. Now. He seemed surprised. I told him flat out that his responses were making less and less sense and that he should not have been this tired. The place was changing him in the same way it had changed me, I could have sworn it. I didn't know why or how, it was simply the truth. And for now, that was all we really needed to know. Kurt did not disagree entirely, but he told me that one thing he wanted to take care of first was to check out a hole they'd come across that day, a rather big one, sort of near the north swamp, covered by layers of branches, a hole big enough to fit a man into. Frustratingly, neither Kurt nor Jill had taken any video of this for me. He apologized for his lack of judgment. He'd been fighting off something bronchial. But suddenly I didn't care about the hole or much else besides their safety, and I urged him again to find Jill, pack up the car, and come back to Lamont, where after a couple of days of a more normal life we could get together and analyze the experience. I asked him to get back on the feed in 1 hour, and then, as an afterthought, I told him to just leave it running if he could. He had enough battery power for that, but he told me the feed would likely stutter and then drop if left on for that long. I wanted to try it anyway. I didn't want to lose that tiny video window onto the tract when Kurt left the frame. I thought maybe I could pick up on some obscure atmospheric alteration if I kept watching uninterrupted. He told me he'd discussed my idea with Jill and agreed to the 1 hour time frame, exactly 1 hour. He moved off camera. I was left watching a more or less static image of the small patch of field that contained their tents. A slight breeze wandered through the line of trees in the background. It grew darker, and I waited for anything to enter the frame to break the monotony, a bird, a squirrel, a swirl of leaves. But nothing came. An hour and 20 minutes later, the objects in the frame were almost indistinguishable with the onset of night. The sky was muddy and bruised, with ugly grays and reds, and there was no sign of Kurt. The tract remained exactly as before. 2 nights after his daughter saw a man with a scary face in the woods somewhere in Carolinas County, Orrin Loveland was awakened from a troubled sleep by his wife, Darcy. The date was November 11th, 1849, according to the heading above the diary entry. She had seen a man outside their bedroom window. She swore it. A man who appeared to be wearing a mask, even though it was almost pitch dark outside and such a detail would have been difficult to make out. It had to have been a mask, she said. It had to. No human head was shaped that way. The man had not been peering into the cabin. He had been moving past the window very slowly on a strangely even pace, almost as if he had been balanced and pulled on some unseen cart. Or maybe floating, Darcy said when she found the courage to joke. Loveland wrote that he spent 20 minutes circling around their remote cabin, looking in all directions for any sign of life. There were no footprints outside their window, a fact which he wasn't fully able to confirm until the next morning. The children, he wrote, thankfully did not wake. Darcy refused to even try to describe the face she had seen beyond referring to the eyes as being in the wrong places, as she very gradually fell back to sleep over the next couple of hours. She admitted that the darkness may have caused her to see aspects of that face that may not have been really there. But the motion of someone outside the window, that had certainly been real, she insisted. It was almost dawn before she drifted off entirely. The next day, Loveland had gone off alone while his wife and children were busy building a new chicken coop. He was truthful with the reason for his exploration, and intended to assure his family that they were still very much alone out here. In the diary, Loveland wrote that he wished he had purchased a dog when they'd moved out here. This is the actual passage he wrote about what happened that day from the photocopied pages of the diary which I made unauthorized. I walked out toward Cattle Road and spent the better part of 2 hours making a wide circle. The closest to town I allowed myself to wander was the easternmost patch of Thaddeus Moore's onion field. I was certain his men never had cause to labor that remotely after the summertime, but I was still as circumspect as I could be. Funny how the aversion to being seen has made me cautious to the absurd, as if one sighting of my face would suddenly give Moore or anyone else knowledge of my troubles and cause them to summon the police. I stood for many minutes in the woods near the South Ravine, listening to the sounds of encroaching wintertime, and as I did so it began to snow once again. Curse the snow, I am not yet educated enough in it to know how to fasten us against it, but we will adapt. At some point last night it must have already snowed atop of the hill. There was a half-inch already there. I looked for footprints without result. Then I went beyond the eastern ridge toward the stables. For if there were some poor homeless wretch living out this way, would he not inhabit the only shelter for miles? The damned stables, such kindling for June's imagination, such invitation to injury. I had never before approached the stables on foot, only horseback, and doing so now gave me pause. If someone wished to do me harm, there could be no more convenient time or place. I found myself hesitant to call out to anyone who might be inside as I entered. As I had once been told by Vaughan Jenkins, the stables were abandoned and decrepit. The path through them was straightforward, but all was very dark in there. The daylight peeked and poked through holes in the overhead boards. At night there would be no navigating the place. The stables had each been marked by hand long ago with a number for the convenience of Carl McConnell's workmen. Even some of them are likely dead by now. Such thoughts I have sometimes. I cut through all the way to the intersection at the west end of the stables, and at the T-corner I went to the left for no particular reason, and around a final dead corner. And there I saw in the cold ground a kind of hole, the width of a cart's wheel, one it must have taken considerable effort to dig. As I stood there, a gentle hand of air came in through the place and pushed a tiny bit of old straw to the edge of the hole, where it seemed to hesitate like a suicide reconsidering his options before it disappeared over the edge. An image that has stayed with me, why I cannot say. I had no wish to see into that hole, for it held no fascination for me beyond the problem of making sure June never comes near this place. I retreated and doubled back the way I came. And now it is time to write of fear, for I can say now that I have felt it in a state as pure as can be known without facing rifle or bayonet. As I emerged out into the white daylight once again, I stopped at the sight of a changed situation. Before me, on the very light blanket of snow, in the exact spot at which I had entered the enclosure, had been placed a very familiar object, unmistakable because of Terry's initials etched on the side. At the cabin, it had been nothing more than the stump where I sometimes split wood and regretfully dispatch our chickens. Sitting here now, unexplained, carried and placed by unfamiliar hands, it could only be a warning from someone who must have followed me. I scanned the landscape rapidly, but saw no one and nothing out of the ordinary. And more impossibly, no footprints in the snow other than mine. Because my presence was obviously considered so vile, I did not so much as turn to peer back into the shadows of the stables. I moved very quickly toward my home. Not until I was at the bottom of the berry hill did I turn to regard the place I had just explored, and I saw no one in pursuit. I began to run for fear that Darcy and the children might be vulnerable. I fell twice before the house came into view, and came to be so drastically winded that a stitch in my side crippled me. I tried to call out to Darcy, but no sound came from my throat. When I was finally able to make my way down to the house, I found everyone safe inside, and unaware of anything wrong. I chose to keep them so. The stump's absence will not be noticed until perhaps the day after tomorrow, if I keep everyone inside. And so to provide myself time to think, I will involve Darcy in the day's lessons, and afterward make it an afternoon and evening of games, which the children should enjoy very much. I fear I must take Terry with me back up the hill. This may happen tomorrow night. The remainder of this evening has been calm. Darcy has had no questions for me, which I find odd. From the library at Stepridge, I hobbled back to my computer at home at 5 o'clock. By then I had finished reading the entire diary, and would have no need to return to the special collections room. I had spent the car ride back home trying to break the full story down in my mind for Kurt, and trying to talk myself into telling him nothing until he returned, so that he wouldn't want to stay out there alone with Jill. I very much wanted for us to regroup and return to the tract together, but that couldn't happen until I fully regained my health. It seemed too dangerous now for us to remain separated like this. The feed was up and running when I clicked into it, but for 10 minutes there was no sign of Kurt. I hadn't noticed that I had an email from him. He'd replied to my own urgent emails about why he'd gone missing without explanation, by merely clicking reply and inserting a link to a video clip. I expected the video would consist of his investigation of the odd hole he'd mentioned. I played it in a smaller window so I could keep an eye on the live feed. To my surprise, Jill's face filled the frame instead of Kurt's. She greeted me pleasantly enough on the video and cut right to the point, which was that she had been musing upon what had happened with the homeless woman Bella DeVere back in 2008. She'd of course gotten all the details from Kurt. The more she had thought about it, Jill said in a wandering monologue, the more sympathy she had for Bella. It seemed to Jill that there may simply have been a primal, instinctual protective impulse that had awakened in her as she camped and became entranced by the extraordinary beauty of her surroundings. That was how Jill phrased it, extraordinary beauty. A curious moment of hyperbole. Perhaps, Jill explained, that instinct had taken her free will away, just as it had most likely been taken away very suddenly once again when I had spoken to her in the hospital of wanting to visit the tract. If Bella had in fact seen herself as the tract's rightful guardian, would it not have made perfect sense to strike at whatever force seemed to threaten it, whether it was a man and wife living quietly on the tract's edge, or a researcher encroaching upon it? Jill spoke very logically and thoughtfully on the computer screen. "Is it not the most essential human right," she said, to destroy the forces that attack the things we are obliged to protect? Who had truly committed that crime off Greentown Road? Bella? Or the man and wife, who surely must have known that they were thoughtlessly trespassing on the tract? It was at this point in the video that I had to pause it to take a moment and process this bizarre line of reasoning before I let Jill speak on. During that pause, I composed a text to Kurt asking where he was, but then quickly remembered that he wouldn't be able to receive it with no cell reception. I sent it anyway. It was too important not to try, and tell him that based on what I had read at Stepridge, they might be in danger. When I resumed the video, Jill quickly moved off the original topic, and informed me simply that she and Kurt were having a terrible time with the speakers in his laptop, and while it was no problem to try to keep the video feed up through the remainder of their stay, any sort of live interaction would be too difficult. Literally within seconds of her video ending, I saw both Kurt and Jill appear live in the frame that showed in real time the area of the tract where their tents were. Kurt had moved the camera back about 20 or 30 feet, getting a wider angle of the area. The tents, I saw to my relief, had been broken down as if they were preparing for departure, hopefully before nightfall, which would be in about 30 minutes. I spoke into my microphone, trying to get their attention, but they didn't hear me. I became incredibly frustrated. I watched as the two of them started to go about the process of building a small fire, something I don't think they'd done before during their stay. That was confusing. There would be no reason for a fire if they were leaving. Once they had brought a few handfuls of sticks and branches to a central spot in the clearing, Kurt knelt and tossed a couple of lit matches into the pile, and Jill fanned the tiny flames for a few minutes until the fire was going rather impressively. They stood there looking at it, wordlessly for a while, and I tried to summon them both again with my voice through the mic. No reaction. And then, inexplicably, Kurt took the cell phone he held in his right hand, and he dropped it into the fire. I leaned forward in my office, not believing my eyes. Seconds later, Jill took her cell phone from her pocket and did the same thing. They stood beside the fire, now watching the flames swallow up what had been offered. They didn't exchange a word, and never once did they look back into the camera, though they must have both known I was watching them, because it was a full 40 minutes now past our scheduled meet-up time. Eventually, Kurt stepped forward to the fire and methodically began to snuff out its edges by kicking dirt onto them. The video feed dropped just about then. That was all right, because I already knew it was time to forget thinking about contacting Kurt anymore and start to think about calling the police. I stupidly talked myself out of that until almost midnight. I spent some of the interim going back over the original video Kurt had shot on his first full day in the tract, when he'd taken the camera all around the area. At the 14-minute mark, among his shots of the ruins of the stables, he had randomly dug out a seemingly insignificant clot of wood amongst all the others. Maybe 8 inches high, 12 wide, worn down from a larger piece that had once been semicircular. There were what appeared to be initials etched into it, barely discernible now. T.A.L. On the night of November 13th, 1849, Orrin Loveland and his son Terry hiked together toward the stables where Orrin had been the day before. They started out at about 11 o'clock, 2 hours after Loveland's wife and daughter had gone to bed. Orrin and Terry made sure they left the cabin very quietly, but they had a story prepared in case their departure was noticed. Loveland wrote that it was a bitterly cold night. It took them a little less than half an hour to reach the slope which ascended slowly toward the area where the stables were. Loveland and his son carried no weapons. Loveland had, for reasons he never explained in the diary, sworn he would never go near another gun. He had been extremely frank with the boy about what he had felt and seen, and Terry, surprisingly mature and strong for 16, had taken it calmly. This is from Loveland's diary entry of that night. The sky was an ugly purple color over the land. I did not care for the way our footsteps crunched in the snow so noisily. I kept my hands inside my coat to keep the cold from biting them so severely. We lost several minutes when we became somehow lost in the trees beside the east ravine. Neither one of us could sort out how that happened, but at some point Terry had tugged on my coat and said, "Papa, we missed the meadow turn." I would have laughed if it hadn't been so odd. Since our arrival here from Lorngore, I've become so forgetful. Seeing the dark hulk of the stables, something tugged strangely inside me, and I was overcome by a vision of no seeming meaning. I thought of Darcy waking and lighting a candle and going to the bedroom window. But in my vision, her concern for our well-being lasted only as long as it took to take in her own reflection. In my mind, I saw her touch her face, worried that it was changing somehow. Neither her eyes nor her mouth seemed familiar to her, and it was this that she wanted so badly to tell me, but I was gone. That was the entirety of my vision, and it could be put to no account, and it left me as soon as it had taken me. Terry and I went forward. It surprises me that I allowed our mission to be so ill-defined. Whether I even intended to enter those stables I do not know, unless I were called into them. Standing about 20 feet before the pathway in, I was content to wait and absorb a feel for the quiet, thinking that I might detect a presence, or that a presence would emerge to explain itself. Our chopping stump was still there. A minute passed, Terry as patient as ever. Then I heard his voice behind me, strangled and quiet, and I turned and saw what he saw. I know if I write this part down, it can only serve to frighten me again, decades from now, when and if I take this journal down from the shelf to remind myself of older days. But I read it still. Standing on the ridge, well behind us, were 4 distinct figures. I thank God that the darkness of the night kept them from being fully seen. I can say that the head of each man, if men they were, was grossly larger and more curiously shaped than should have occurred through normal birth. And I cannot swear that they were possessed of any arms between them. And as if they were merely fence posts built by workmen, they stood rooted by not pairs of legs, but rather one very thick leg each. In this way they appeared from a distance to be uniform in nature, 4 of the same atrocious design. Terry and I stayed utterly quiet. If I were asked why I should believe these presences were even living things, I would not be able to prove it empirically, but only speak of a feeling that they were watching us, and not needing to come any closer to do so. Terry finally asked me what we were to do. I whispered that we should merely retreat quickly, head for the opposite slope. I thought I perceived the large head of one of those silhouettes slowly turning, and I believed that I had miscounted the presences, for there were now 5 of them on the ridge, not 4. I stepped forward and grabbed Terry by the shoulder and forcibly turned him to me, so he could see through the dark the urgency in my gaze, and we began to move. Walking with such a hurried gait was hard going, with trying not to fall in the snow, but we were away from the stables in less than a minute and not looking back. At some point we found ourselves actually running for the woods. Visibility inside them was very poor. We stumbled through them, angling our path toward the east as much as we were able to judge. It was my hope to come across the skinny stream, and from there change direction. We stopped when we'd exhausted ourselves and caught our breath while looking back, always back. If someone were following us, we could not tell at all. The moonlight was an insufficient sextant. I know that Terry did not begin to feel safe again until we did in fact come across the stream, and he spotted the old ash tree, a familiar sight. Our path described an exaggerated loop back home. When Terry spoke, it was to ask me, "What do we do, Papa?" But I had no good answer for him. Only that neither his mother nor June needed to know what we had seen. I forbade him to speak of it, while assuring him that we would no longer live out here, so far from Lorengor. He was greatly relieved. I cannot say which one of us stopped being truly afraid first, but I can report that I was never courageous in looking back over my shoulder at the land that lay just behind us, not for one moment, until the house came into view again, nearly 3/4 of an hour after we left the stables, by my estimation. This will be the last time I leave this house after dark. By Providence, Darcy and June were still asleep. I myself did not sleep a wink for the rest of the night, keeping one eye on the window pane, and keenly attuned to any sound from outside. Some hours later I turned and beheld the dim sight of Darcy, now lying awake beside me, staring at the ceiling. I confessed that Terry and I had been out, and that there were persons nearby who were likely to make our life here difficult, and we would prepare to leave that very morning. To my disquiet, Darcy asked for not a single detail of what Terry and I had seen. She merely accepted my statement at face value and urged me not to act hastily, for she was not at all afraid, and had much to do before we departed for Lorengor. And now it is morning, and she is still coolly rational about what needs to be done, and has again left it to me to decide our course, for as she put it, "Leaving would be a shame. It will be so pretty in spring, unlike any place we have ever dreamed of. Let's not make plans that put too much toil on you. We have no quarrel with anyone, after all." I find her mood very curious. That was the last journal entry that Orrin Loveland ever made. But there was one more passage left in that tattered volume, entered in completely different handwriting and undated, so there was no indication as to just when that other person made it. Here's what it says verbatim. So kind, so kind. They have come to me 3 nights in a row, though they cannot speak or move in the way we care to define it. They have been so clear. They want only to stay, and come out sometimes to eat the sunlight. Their claim to everything that lies around us is greater than ours, surely, having been written long before the earth itself was ever dreamed. And so I will protect them. I can be strong. Orrin is confused all the time now, and irrational, but they have made it known to me why this is. They have great difficulty in communicating with the male of the species. Their thoughts become sharp and frightening in the expression of them, and men have been driven mad instead of doing what must be done. But I understand the singers easily, as if I were born for the purpose. I feel myself becoming stronger each day and angry at even the notion that any harm would come to the ones I must protect. Tonight they will sing to me again, and I will listen. End of the journal. At Stepbridge I had read that last entry again and again, and then, as I had put the journal back into its plastic container, my mind spinning, I took notice again of the small round green sticker on the box, with the typewritten code on it, F94. With an idea and a vague hope brewing in my mind, I had asked the librarian what the significance was of the colored dots on the boxes on the special collection shelves, green in particular. She told me that green meant there were related items in the clippings archive. She led me into another room filled with wooden, color-coded filing cabinets. In the one marked with a green flag, I had found a manila folder marked F94. Someone had written the date when this file was first placed into the archives, and that date was 22 years ago. There were only 2 clippings inside the folder. The first was a cheap photocopy of an original page from the Argus Daily Dispatch, dated March 3rd, 1850. The article was, in essence, a plea for information about a woman in her 30s and a little girl who must have been her daughter. Both had been accused of acting in a, quote, shockingly violent manner toward a party of choir singers who had been traveling on something called Cattle Road, east of Blaine Fountain in Carolinas County, and had to stop because of a broken carriage wheel. There had been some sort of struggle after the unidentified woman and the girl emerged from the woods on foot, and the carriage driver had been taken to a hospital. The 2 poor wretches had been remanded into custody, and were described as utterly incapable of speech, most likely mute from birth. The second clipping was also from the Argus Daily Dispatch. It was published 11 months after the first. The authorities, searching for a missing old man with dementia, the father of the local constable, in fact, had come across a tiny, mostly empty cabin with a collapsed roof near the Blaine Fountain town line, the exact location omitted by poor reporting. In what served as that moribund structure's front yard were found 2 shallow graves, and the bodies of 2 men, one about 40, the other most likely younger than 20. Foul play was suspected in both deaths. Again, there was an appeal for any information about their identity. Someone had made the connection between these events and the contents of Orrin Loveland's diary 22 long years before me, and without a note of explanation, had secured these clippings in a cheap manila folder to be forgotten in the university archives. I will never know who was trying to put the pieces together, or where their research eventually took them. On that day, even before I witnessed Kurt and Jill burn their phones, I had simply run out of time to find out. An officer of the Carolinas County Police got back to me 2.5 hours after I called in at 12:30 a.m. on the 21st with my concern about Kurt and his sister Jill. They had gone camping in a tract near Blaine Fountain, I told the officer, inventing a story about how they'd both been completely out of contact for 2 days, despite assuring me they had returned to Lamont at exactly noon on Tuesday. I said nothing about either the video feed, which had never been re-established on Kurt's end after it went dark following their bizarre bonfire, or the research we'd been undertaking. I was able to give Officer Krantz the exact location of their tents and the vehicle they'd taken out there. They were amateur astronomers, I said, who thought the tract would be a good isolated spot to set up their telescopes. Krantz had driven out as a courtesy. What he reported back to me was very confusing. There had been no sign of Kurt's SUV, he said, and a hike through the dark to the spot in question revealed nothing at all. Not even any real sign that they'd been camping there. If they'd been there, they'd taken all traces with them and left. He and I reviewed the directions I'd given him, and he described his path with perfect accuracy. He'd even wandered a little further and called out several times to anyone who might be in the area. He'd gotten no response. Trying to get whatever information I could from him, I asked him how familiar he was with that area. But he'd been with the Lorengore precinct for less than a year, and was of no more help to me. The thought of exploring the tract myself in the dark in my condition was too intimidating, and so I tried to sleep some, setting my alarm for 5 a.m. The ringing of my phone woke me. The one person who could conceivably have gone with me into the tract, without me worrying intensely for his safety, was finally returning the somewhat pleading message I'd left for him the night before. At the age of 65, Pavel Klug, a professional sailor since he was 13, was still built like a weightlifter. He was also the only person I'd ever encountered whose claims to psychic abilities had never been disproven by anyone. I had given up on his help already, though. There just wouldn't be enough time now for him to reach me from Pennsylvania. Still, I began to explain the situation to him. but as I thought he might, he stopped me almost immediately. His bitterness toward me seeped through the phone like black oil. He said he always knew that one day my slipshod research methods and my blind spots would ruin me. He accused me of already almost costing one life back at Hengist Castle. He disconnected with a pitying chuckle. There wouldn't have been anything I could say in my defense anyway. I took 3 aspirin and made my way out to my car for the trip to the tract. My pain level was, by unfortunate coincidence, unusually high. For some small sliver of peace of mind, I brought with me the only lethal weapon I owned, which was a hunting knife an uncle had given to me 10 years before, and which had gone utterly unused. My hope was that I would find nothing, that I would have missed Kurt and Jill because they were even now driving back to Lamont. If that were the case, we could laugh about my foolish journey later. The morning was cold, and the sun tried vainly here and there to break through the clouds. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I missed the turn onto Route 4. Another 10 minutes lost. I listened to classical music as I drove. As usual, there was no real traffic, especially at this sleepy hour. In front of the little antique and frame shop, which represented the very last place of business one saw before making the final turn down Greentown Road toward the tract, a police car was parked, its emergency flashers on. I tried not to think again of the inexplicable crime statistics I'd found relating to this sparsely populated area, and I looked away. And how futile it was that I found myself trying to analytically monitor my thoughts for disturbing anomalies or gaps as I turned onto Greentown Road and made my way, so paranoid that another return to the tract would trigger something in me, make me descend quickly back into that foggy mental state that had been caused by overexposure to whatever was out here. Or maybe I had built up a tolerance. Only 2 cars came down Greentown Road, and of course there were none on the unmarked 2-mile dirt road that branched off it. I don't think I had ever seen one traveling there. I got a jolt when far off to my left in the woods 3 deer suddenly broke into a run as I passed, at first headed right into my path, but angling away instinctively before they broke the tree line. As Officer Krantz had confirmed for me, there was, in fact, no sign of Kurt's SUV in the spot where he'd told me he'd parked. So I parked there myself. I took a deep breath, opened the driver's side door, and climbed out with my usual elderly motions, hyper-cautious not to hit my head and experience a burst of pain I would feel down into my legs. I found the trail and set down it, forcing myself to move just a little more quickly than I was comfortable with, a dull, thudding ache growing in my back, hating myself for having canceled one too many physical therapy sessions. I first began to feel truly afraid when emerging into the clearing, where Kurt and Jill's tents should have been. Seeing absolutely nothing there, that was very bad somehow. A couple of nights before there had been human life in this space, and now all traces were gone. I couldn't even tell where their crude campfire had been, the one where they'd burned their cell phones. Nothing but dead grass and dirt now. With some effort I did find evidence of the small holes their tent poles had made in the cold ground. Krantz had simply missed them in the dark. Kurt's tent here, Jill's about 8 feet away. It was like coming across the ghostly ruins of some extinct forest tribe. I looked all around and, having nothing but time, just stood and listened and waited for several minutes before heading off toward the west, in the general direction of the tract's true ruins, the rotting, earth-eaten heap of wood that had once comprised the stables, owned by some farmer named Carl McConnell. That 1.75-mile walk was, to me, so long that by the time I reached the bottom of the slow rise upward toward them, I was sweating profusely. My head was pounding and my back was throbbing like a fist was trying to punch its way out of me. I had to wait for a time before making my final ascent, and I stopped halfway there, wanting badly to lie down but afraid of the agony of getting back up again. Walking the length of the pile, I studied again the way the old wood had slowly become one with the ground, how certain boards had settled at seemingly impossible angles as the rot had taken hold, how more and more detail of the grain had faded to a featureless gray and black over the decades. I saw no evidence that anything had been tampered with in the slightest. The ruins seemed entirely intact. I noticed one piece of wood alone off to one side, closer to the tree line on the west side, and as I got closer to it, the sun suddenly glinted off it, as if it weren't wood at all. I realized what I was seeing just seconds before I stood over it. It was a laptop computer lying in the dead grass. Kneeling down to lift it, my spine screamed out in pain, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. It had happened before. I took the computer, ice cold to the touch, past the tree line and into the woods, searching for a spot with the most shadows so that when the computer was turned on, I'd be able to defeat the glare of daylight. I sat on a fallen pine, grateful to be off my feet, and booted up the computer. It came to life with no difficulty. The battery was still a quarter charged. I squinted to make out the icons on the desktop. They were mostly folders. One was marked GGI, my initials. And when I opened it, I saw all the documents I had sent to Kurt the month before, relating to what I had found of the history of the tract. Another folder was marked with the word videos. I opened that one and saw several icons consisting of single still frames, each dated and timed. Clicking through them, it seemed I had already watched all the videos except for one. Sorting the list by date, there was a clip that had been saved just 2 hours before. A fairly long one, judging by how much hard drive storage it had claimed. I clicked on it. This was not footage that had been shot carefully using the Panasonic camera Kurt had brought with him into the tract. The angle was low and skewed, as if someone had placed the laptop itself on the ground and shot the video using its cheap internal camera. The picture quality was much more grainy, especially because it was just barely dawn when the recording occurred. In the frame, I saw Kurt back away from the lens as if he had just pressed record. Kurt and Jill were in the woods, and judging by where I'd found the laptop, it must have been somewhere close. Jill was sitting on a log at such the far left edge of the frame that only her legs were visible. Kurt hadn't turned the lens far enough in her direction, an unusually clumsy act for someone who normally operated at such a high level of detail. Kurt sat down with his back against a tree, 10 feet away from her, and addressed the camera. The sound was so poor I had to go into the computer's settings briefly to amplify it as much as I possibly could. I believe Kurt was speaking directly to me when he said that before he and Jill returned to Lamont, they wanted a record of a new game they'd thought up while they were out here in the middle of nowhere. They were still working on the rules, he said. Then he asked Jill if she wanted to go first, and I just barely heard her say yes. Oddly, neither one of them was wearing a jacket or coat, despite the fact that it was so very cold. Kurt rolled up the left sleeve of his flannel shirt, and Jill entered the frame fully, moving over to him. She knelt down in the leaves beside him, took his forearm in her right hand, and bent her head to it. Kurt was expressionless, watching her with what seemed like only mild interest. The back of Jill's head was to the camera when she seemed to put her mouth directly onto Kurt's forearm, at which point she went very still. Kurt's face changed then, becoming flushed and red in an instant, and Jill's head began to shake left and right. She lifted her head suddenly, and Kurt let out a cry of pain. There was a gash on his forearm, as Jill retreated to where she had sat before, only her legs visible on the frame. Kurt was bleeding. He did nothing to stop it or even examine the wound, while Jill's hands undid the laces of the Timberland boot on her right foot, shucking both the boot and her sock off. Kurt moved over to her and knelt down, as she had for him. He cradled her foot and lifted it toward him, cocked his head this way and that, looking for a certain spot, and then he put his mouth on the soft underside of her right heel. The camera angle showed me what happened more clearly this time. Kurt's mouth clasped firmly on his sister's heel as he sunk his teeth into it. There was only the slightest utterance of discomfort from Jill. Kurt gripped her foot tightly in both hands and started to moan with effort, tugging with his teeth. After 10 full seconds, he yanked his head away, and with it came a spout of blood. Jill lowered her foot out of frame. As Kurt retreated and took his spot again with his back against the tree, he casually wiped her blood from his mouth. A jet that had passed overhead at that precise moment caught his attention, and he looked up at the sky with casual interest. Then he was unbuttoning his shirt. Jill came into view again, limping a little. Kurt exposed his left shoulder blade to his sister. She knelt down as before and lowered her head onto it, placing her left hand tenderly on his neck. Kurt craned his head to the sky. This time, as Jill clamped her teeth down into his flesh, he opened his mouth wide and cocked his head all the way back, half in pain, but half, I would swear, in pleasure. Jill's head began to shake back and forth. I closed the video before it went any further. I had made it 8 minutes into a video whose total duration was 17. I scanned the woods, willing myself to go further in, but I found that my will had abandoned me completely. I took the laptop with me and started to make my way back to the spot where I had entered the tract, downing more aspirin as I walked, the pain in my lower back growing and growing until I walked with one hand pinned permanently to my side. If I happened to plant my left foot wrong on a patch of ground that was too uneven, white and pink light flashed inside my eyes. I would not spend another minute searching for Kurt and Jill. I had now, at least, the evidence I'd need to get the police to comb the area entirely. And if the full truth of the situation had to be told, it had to be told. Halfway back to where they'd camped, I had no choice but to sit on the ground for a time, spent, near a thatch of bushes splitting the remains of a meadow in two. I tilted my head to look off into the woods, convinced that it was only a matter of time before I saw something in there, an inert being that could barely be described, watching me. As it happened, one living organism did come for me, shortly before I began to maneuver my body slowly into a standing position again. I heard a flap of wings, and a giant black bird, a vulture, settled nearby. When I walked away, it remained, watching me go. 50 yards from my spot, I turned, and it was still there. If I had been brave, I would have veered toward the swamp where Kurt and Jill had discovered that mysterious hole, never to mention it again after their first report of it. But that never felt like an option. By the time I got to my car, my heart was pounding disturbingly fast, and not just with physical pain. Every yard I grew closer to the driver's side door, the more I was convinced I wouldn't make it there at all, that I'd be intercepted. When I was safely inside and the door was locked, I saw in the rearview mirror that tears of effort had spread across my cheeks. The engine started smoothly, and I turned back down the unmarked road to trace my path out with no variation. I turned off the road a mile south and got back onto Greentown, driving at half speed, looking into the woods for any sign of anything that might give me information about Kurt and Jill. It was in vain. I brought the car up to full speed just as I passed the little house that my attacker, Bella DeVere, had tried to burn down in 2008, where Marvin Litko now lived. About 800 yards from what I considered to be the entrance to the tract. Rolling by, I detected the tiniest thump as my wheels passed over a small object. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw a shoe coming to rest in the middle of the road after being jostled at 30 miles per hour. And I pulled the car over onto the thin, muddy shoulder. I shut off the engine and climbed out of the car and walked slowly back up the road along a faded double yellow line that may never have been repainted once. The image of Jill's Timberlands was strong on my mind as I got closer to that shoe, which looked very similar to what she'd been wearing in the video. But looking more closely, I saw that in fact the shoe was far more weathered and of cheaper manufacture. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. From my vantage point, I could see the edge of Mr. Litko's front yard. There was a car on the driveway, as I believed there usually was. I picked up the shoe and carried it over there. There was no answer to my knocks on the Litko's front door. I set the shoe down on the porch, and, praying that no one inside the house would notice, I turned the doorknob to see if it was loose. It was. No one had locked it. Someone was either home or overly trusting. I decided to push my luck, opening the door just a crack. I called out a hello 2 times, but there was no response. I shut the door behind me and started across the yard again. I thought about calling the police as I went, but had to remind myself that I'd get no reception out here until I got almost all the way out to Catskill Downs Road. Perhaps I could have used Litko's landline. I realize now that wouldn't have helped me. I had stepped back onto the shoulder of Greentown when I spotted something in the woods across the road. Far away, probably almost 50 yards in, I could make out someone standing beside a tree, leaning against it somewhat, facing directly away from me. Someone wearing a flannel shirt. I crossed the road and headed toward this person, stepping left and right out of the way of trees as necessary. More detail revealed itself to me as I crunched through the leaves, making my presence known from a good distance away. It was a man, definitely, wearing baggy jeans. His hair was white. He didn't move. I thought maybe he was tracking something deeper in the woods, concentrating. 20 yards away, just before I called out to him so he wouldn't be alarmed as I approached, I saw that he was wearing only one shoe. The other was gone. Then this motionless man's weight against the tree was shifting, and he was slowly crumpling right before my eyes. He made no effort to right himself as he leaned way too far to his left and collapsed into the leaves like a bag of sand. I called out and hobbled to him as fast as I could. He had fallen face down with an empty thud, with his left arm pinned beneath him. There was a blood stain on the tree where he had been leaning, and blood on the ground beneath me, more and more of it as I got to where he lay. I knelt and struggled to turn him over. He was very heavy. It was Marvin Litko. He had been gravely wounded on his left side. His shirt was drenched in blood there. For the first time I saw what he may have been looking at as he'd leaned against that tree, dying. It was the unnaturally bent and crumpled body of Kurt Kapremian, about 30 yards further in, his lifeless eyes staring directly at me. There were soft footsteps behind me in the leaves. I turned and slowly rose, sweat trickling down into my eyes. Jill Kapremian was standing beside a tree that I had passed 60 seconds before. She must have watched me go right by. She was holding a long chopping axe in her hands. A leaf was stuck to its head, adhered to it by a large blotch of dark blood. She looked at me with wide, questioning eyes and set one foot ahead of the other, gently, as if she were afraid to scare me away. The entire left side of her mouth had suffered a tremendous wound, a sizable portion of skin completely torn away, or bitten away. and completely untreated. She was deathly pale. "Why do all you bugs come so close?" she asked me. "Why do all you bugs come so close?" She began to raise the axe as she came forward, and I believe she asked that question a third time before I pulled the hunting knife from my belt and moved forward as swiftly as I could before the axe could be lifted fully over Jill's head for a single downswing. It was as if she could not even conceive of my act of defense. Her surprise as the knife plunged into her chest was as mild as if I had told her we were due for rain despite the sporadic sunshine. She made a small wet sound in her throat and sank to her knees, dropping the axe into the leaves, and when my right hand opened again, the knife was gone. Jill collapsed onto her side, a twisted and inadvertent grin locked on her face. She turned over, got to her knees, and took 3 bizarre and directionless steps while still on them, clomping forward as if she were pretending to be a monster in a child's game of pretend. And then she fell again, not 10 feet from Marvin Litko. Jill must have turned on Kurt right after their game, finally perceiving him as a threat to the tract, then made her way to Litko's house. Or maybe that's where she'd gotten the axe. With 2 corpses at my feet, I turned to face the road again, but I would never get back to it, because my way through the woods was now blocked by a jagged row of many, many tall, inert, armless figures, with heads so anatomically distorted that it seemed each was wearing a cruel, oversized wax mask atop a body rooted to the ground by a single thick, featureless stump. Their eyes were not where they should have been. For all I know, I may still have been screaming when someone in authority came hours later and took me away. As I write this, I am currently in the basement of a police station in Lorengor, waiting to be taken somewhere else, but the details of where I might go next are unclear. In searching the tract, the authorities must have already come across the hole near the swamp that Kurt spoke of. The one I never got to see, or they're at least very close to finding it. And if not that one, maybe another. That's where things might get really interesting, I suppose. In relating this story, it's interesting how I've gotten some people's names wrong and mixed up the names of roads and dates and times. I forget even if I've told you about where they found Kurt's SUV. This has not been the telling of a sane man. I suppose if I were to ever venture into the tract again, I'd have maybe 1 hour before the undetectable voices of those who inhabit it drive me mad in their efforts to convert me into a guardian. Maybe less than an hour, because seeing what I saw in the woods at the end has probably done me permanent damage. I sit here now, waiting for news, and I wonder how many women they happen to have combing the tract for evidence, and if even now they're being sung to without even realizing it, in tones only they can comprehend. I wonder how many of them will have to keep going back, spending more and more time there as the discoveries mount, their minds gently invaded over the course of days. Perhaps like Bella DeVere, like Darcy and June Loveland, like Jill Capremian, they'll come to embrace the singing as an invitation to a profound mission, one of relentless and unending protection, maybe one that will require great violence to achieve.